Imperial Star Destroyer, from Star Wars to the real world. How is it possible and what will come of this? Today, we will answer these questions. We will take a detailed look at the history of the creation and characteristics of one of the main symbols of Star Wars. On the scroll bar, we get closer to the first chapter. Fasten your seatbelts and subscribe to the channel. Nordy is with you, and we are starting. During the Clone Wars, the Republic had two main capital ships, the Venator and the Acclamator. Very good ships that showed themselves worthy during the war, but they did not entirely suit the Admiralty. Venator, about which there was a big video on the channel, was a hybrid of a heavy cruiser and an aircraft carrier, and it had several significant shortcomings. Firstly, the weapons, although powerful, are small in number, and although the Venator was superior in firepower to most CIS ships, the fleet needed a battleship, not a heavy aircraft carrying cruiser. Secondly, the hangar, which should have been the main advantage, but in the end turned out to be more of a disadvantage of the ship. So, a huge sliding hangar significantly reduced the survivability of the ship, and the excessively large air group consisting of 450 aircraft did not have time to leave the ship in full force during the battle. In a reasonable amount of time, it was possible to launch no more than 100 aircraft into space, a quarter of the entire air group. It turned out that a huge part of the internal space was not used. The Acclamator, in turn, was a multifunctional ship. Assault ships and heavy cruisers were built on its basis. There was also an aircraft carrying modification, but it was not relevant due to the presence of the Venator. The Acclamator, in the form of a heavy cruiser, did not quite suit the military, who wanted a more armed ship. Then, at the end of the war, it was adopted Victory-class Star Destroyer, a co-production between Kuat and Rendili. The reason for the merger of competitors was the deadlines that Rendili alone could not meet. The fact is that when Kuat received a secret order for ships for the Grand Army of the Republic, Rendili's Star Drive company was left in the dust, and without taking action, it could go bankrupt in the future due to lack of orders. As a result, they hastily began to create a new ship, but they themselves did not have time. Then they collaborated with Kuat. Eventually, Victory-class, which was developed by Valix Blissex, turned out to be a very good ship. Powerful weapons, excellent armor, and a hangar for only a couple of squadrons. What the military wanted. The battleship worked perfectly in conjunction with the Venator. Looking at the successes of competitors, Kuat himself began very vigorous activity in developing new warships. As a result, the Kuatians presented three projects at once: Tector-class, Secular-class, and Imperial-class Star Destroyers. It is noteworthy that Lyra Wessex, then Blissex, took part in the development of all three ships, the one who created Venator. All three ships turned out to be very interesting. The Secular was a direct continuation of the Venator, 2,200 meters long, further developing the concept of a heavy aircraft-carrying cruiser. It turned out well, but the ship did not make it in time for the Clone Wars, and in the Galactic Empire, in the presence of the Venator, it turned out to be unnecessary. As a result, very few Seculars were built. The number of Tectors was greater, but compared to the Emperors, it was minuscule. Tector was a very heavily armed battleship, more than 2 kilometers long, with hangars completely missing. He had so many turbolasers that he could take on an entire fleet alone. The battleship was intended to work in conjunction with Venator. It worked out even better than with Victory-class. First, it was decided to release a pre-production batch of Tectors. Several battleships entered trial service into the Republic Navy at the end of the war. One of these ships, named Gibbon, became the flagship of the squadron aimed at the planet Honduin in the Outer Rim, Square S7. Separatist saboteurs were able to infiltrate the Gibbon and quietly download a virus into its system, which spread to all ships of the squadron. As a result, during the battle, the shields of all ships in the squadron were turned off, and the Republic suffered a tremendous defeat. Engineers had to rush to finalize Tector's defense system. While Tector's malfunctions were being finalized, Lyra Wessex, who personally had designed the Imperial, managed to finish her ship. As a result, by the time Tector was ready, it was simply no longer needed. Firstly, because the Tector was an exceptional battleship, not capable of multi-role use. Secondly, the ISD-1 was already in full swing, which was a multifunctional ship and much better suited to the Empire. So, the newly formed galactic state needed a universal ship, capable of transporting numerous troops, having moderate hangars for an air group, and being well armed. That's how it was created, Imperial-class Star Destroyer, the first generation of Imperial, which was further improved and evolved into the Imperial-class Star Destroyer. Imperial of the second generation. In the old canon, the very first ISD entered the fleet of the Galactic Republic and managed to take part in the Clone Wars. In the new canon, ISD appeared a year later, already in the Imperial period. For the construction of the reference ISD-1, the price of which was 130 million credits and the length was 1,600 meters, it took only 6 months at the Kuat's shipyards, 2 months longer than on Venator. The planet's orbital infrastructure made it possible to build up to 1,200 battleships per year. But then, the construction of all other ships would have to be stopped, which is why several hundred Imperials left the stocks of Kuat every year. ISDs were simultaneously assembled at dozens of different shipyards throughout the galaxy, including on Corellia. By the way, Corellian ISDs were considered the fastest, both in hyperspace and in space. The Imperial naval commanders loved them much more than the Kuat's ones. It's funny, isn't it? In the real world, such incidents also happen. For example, the famous American M4 rifle produced by the Bushmaster Company is of higher quality than the same rifle produced by the Native Colt Company, which created the M4. The scale of ISD construction was such that by the time of the Battle of Endor, the Imperial fleet numbered 25,000 battleships, and these are just the Imperials. Although on a smaller scale, they continued to build Victory-class. Such a huge fleet, by the way, the largest fleet in the galaxy in all history, was needed by Palpatine to resist the future invasion of the Yuuzhan Vong, an intelligent and very warlike race from another galaxy. But only the Emperor himself knew about the race of intergalactic emigrants, so for many around him, the colossal construction of the Imperial fleet looked like an inappropriate use of funds that could have been used for various social programs. Even Mon Mothma, while in the Imperial Senate, argued that the construction of the ISD was unreasonably expensive, costing the Empire half of its entire state budget. Although the rebel senator exaggerated for her political purposes, the cost of the Star Destroyer fleet did require colossal financial resources. However, by the time of the massive construction of new battleships, Palpatine already had access to the finances of the banking clan and other megacorporations, which made it possible not to worry about emptying the treasury. During production and operation of the ISD, the battleship had 4 main weapon configurations. In the very first series, Imperials had the following weapons: 60 Time-and-Back XX-9 heavy turbolaser cannons, in 2-gun, or, less commonly, 3-gun turrets. On the sides of the superstructure there were only 16 guns, in 8 2-gun turrets, with 4 turrets per side. In addition to them, another 24 guns were spread along the sides of the ship. Another 20 guns were located in the bow of the ship. 60 Borstal NK-7 ion cannons in 1 and 2-gun turrets. Accommodation: 20 in the bow, 15 on the starboard side, 15 on the port side, and 10 on the stern. Some of the stern ones were located at the top of the superstructure. Also, 10 Phylon Q7 tractor beam projectors, 6 in the bow and 2 on board. This is the most stingy option in the ISD arsenal. It was not always enough to guarantee the destruction of the enemy. There were fewer battleships with such weapons, and many of them were later rearmed to the new standard. It included 60 Time-and-Back XX-9 heavy turbolaser cannons in a similar configuration, that is, in the same places and in the same turret. The same goes for 60 Borstal NK-7 ion cannons, the same number with the same arrangement. Previous 10 Phylon Q7 projectors. Plus to all this were 12 heavy turbolaser cannons in 6 2-gun turrets, 4 heavy ion cannons in 2 2-gun turrets, 9 turbolasers in 3 3-gun turrets located in the central part of the ship, and 2 turrets with quadruple medium turbolasers on the sides, similar to those from Venator. In total, 27 new guns have been added. The first generation ISD had this type of armament, but the engineers didn't stop there, and the next generation of the Imperial, ISD-2, was armed even more powerfully. Why? The fact is that following the principle of a real-world dreadnought, only big guns, the ISD did not have intermediate caliber guns, for example, light turbolasers, fast enough to fire against corvettes, gunboats, and numerous fighters, bombers, and torpedo bombers that pose a real threat to the ship. In part, this role could be played by 9 turbolasers in the center of the ship and turrets with medium turbolasers. But that's partly it. To fully combat the enemy's Mosquito fleet, anti-aircraft guns were needed, which the captains and admirals of the Republican fleet were accustomed to when dealing with the Venator. As was said in the corresponding video, it had about 60 anti-aircraft points. The absence of anti-aircraft guns on the Imperial looked even stranger. Engineers took up the matter again and added 40 light, rapid-fire laser cannons. As a result, the third configuration of ISD weaponry was replenished with 40 new light guns. Otherwise, the arsenal remained the same. However, Imperial classes with anti-aircraft guns was the least. Alas. But little does not mean 1, 2, or 10. In a fleet of more than 20,000 ISDs, several hundred triangles were flying around the galaxy equipped with anti-aircraft dots. For example, in the battle on Scarif II, Imperial class without anti-aircraft guns took part. These were ships of older models. But even this was not enough for the Imperial admirals. There were people who wanted to see ships with even more powerful main guns. Just at that time, the active construction of the Imperial's second generation was underway. Among other things, new main caliber turrets appeared on them. Those same famous 8-gun turrets with heavy turbolasers. They also began to be installed on old ships. The total number of barrels has not changed much. It was 60, now it is 64. But due to their concentration and optimization of the fire control system, it was possible to significantly increase the firepower of the ship without significantly increasing the number of guns. But at the same time, some of the ion cannons were removed. From 60, 40 remained. However, they were not needed in such quantities. As a result, the fourth weapon set of ISD-1 became the most common and looked like this. But by this time we're already riveting ISD-2 with might and main. During the design and construction of the Imperials of second generation, engineers again revised the composition of weapons for the third time. The first modernized pizza slices appeared shortly before the Battle of Yavin, but their full-scale construction began only after this shameful defeat for the Empire. The construction of new generation ships proceeded at the same speed, and the modernization of old ISD-1s to the ISD-2 level was even faster. As a result, by the Battle of Endor, the vast majority of ISDs were second generation. In ISD-2, almost all the main components and assemblies were updated. In addition, new and more powerful sensors and communication systems have been installed. Some design flaws were corrected, and the armor was significantly strengthened, which contributed to the overall survivability of the ship. But most importantly, firepower was significantly increased. The ISD-2 had 2 main weapon set, 64 Time and Back XX-9, heavy turbo laser cannons and 8 monstrous-looking 8-gun turrets, from 36 to 50 ISI-7 turbo lasers in 18 or 25 twin-gun turrets. Most often, there were 36 of these guns, 20 Borstal NK-7 heavy ion cannons, and 10 tractor beam projectors. In total, 100 or more heavy turbo lasers of the main caliber, and again, not a single anti-aircraft gun. In the second version of the ISD-2 weapons, the XI-7 turbo lasers were replaced by the same number of XX-9. In total, 100 heavy turbo laser cannons of the main caliber, some in 8-gun turrets, some in 2-gun turrets. Ions and beam projectors remained unchanged. Now let's look at the concept of using the ISD arsenal in battle. Thanks to the abundant variety of different weapons, the Emperor had a significant range of capabilities to turn enemy ships into scrap. The ISD-2 had especially many firing options. Thanks to those same 8-gun turrets, they had 3 main firing options. Option 1. Alternate rapid fire with each barrel at low power. While the first gun is reloading, the remaining 7 guns will fire 1 similar shot each. At the end of this cycle, the first barrel was already reloaded and cooled to prevent overheating of the gun. It turns out that fire from the tower could be carried out continuously. The rate of fire is no worse than that of a machine gun. This use of turbo lasers often compensated for the lack of anti-aircraft weapons. Barrage fire from 8 towers at once could cause enormous problems for enemy aircraft. This shooting mode was also capable of demotivating the enemy. Imagine what it was like for a rebel and later a new Republican when 8 turbo laser batteries and several ion batteries in addition fired at him at machine gun speed. However, the accuracy of such shooting was not very high. In addition, it was not possible to fire at targets coming from the stern of the battleship. But this made it possible to shoot down some of the enemy fighters and torpedo bombers, or at least scare them away. When firing at large targets, the size of a gunboat, the accuracy was very excellent. To combat such targets, two main methods of firing were used. Option 2. Simultaneous salvo with all guns at medium or maximum power. One such salvo with all the turrets, that is, 64 guns, could destroy the corvette, immediately removing the power shield. Ships of the frigate class, light cruiser, and cruiser could withstand such an avalanche of fire, and even remain with a shield. However, the salvo was so powerful that the residual energy of the shots passed through the shield and caused damage to the target's hull. With some luck, the shield projector could get damaged, and the shield would collapse. Like this. One salvo of all guns, and the enemy cruiser could be left without a shield. Option 3. Shooting was carried out at medium or maximum power in successive salvos of 4 barrels. Thus, the rate of fire was twice as high, but the power was half as low. This method of firing was used in battle with ships of the cruiser class and above: cruiser, heavy cruiser, battle cruiser, battleship. In addition to turbolasers, Borstel NK-7 ion cannons were actively used in battles, which worked very well in tandem with 8-gun XX-9 batteries. The cannon's ion salvos were excellent at removing shields and then disabling the ship's electronics. In conjunction with turbolasers, Borstel NK-7 coped perfectly even with the very powerful and high-quality deflectors of the Venator. Some heavy Mon Calamari cruisers like MC-80, MC-80A, MC-80B, and others, even on the MC-90, whose shields were, so to speak, double. They withstood the blow well and quickly reloaded. The downside in the ISD arsenal of both generations is the complete absence of missile and torpedo weapons. Moreover, the same Venator had torpedoes, and the Imperial-class Star Destroyer had 20 launchers at once, with an ammunition supply of 80 heavy-class missiles. Even Acclamator II had up to 100 torpedoes in its arsenal. Yes, there were modified ISDs with universal launchers, but there were very few of them, and on a galactic scale, they did not play a significant role. For example, on 2 captured battleships, Emancipator and Liberator, New Republic engineers installed 6 torpedo tubes each during a major overhaul at the Hast shipyard, Wild Space Territory, Square U6. In Imperial service, these ships bore the names Accuser and Adjudicator, and were unremarkable ships. Due to the wedge-shaped shape of the ship's hull and the placement of its guns, the ISD could fire in the forward hemisphere from all barrels, just like the Venator. This made it possible to achieve maximum efficiency in linear squadron combat when moving head-on. However, this configuration also had a disadvantage. When firing towards one of the sides, only half of the entire arsenal could be used, and firing into the rear hemisphere, when the enemy approached from the stern, was completely impossible. For the coordinated operation of weapons, the ISD was equipped with high-quality scanners, sensors, and the Lagrange fire control system. Long and medium-range detection sensors are located on the superstructure between the domes of the protective field generators. The remaining sensors were located on an elevation on the bow of the battleship. Detection devices were capable of detecting targets located in hyperspace and ready to exit it in the near future, which made it possible to detect the enemy in advance and prepare for battle. The effective range of the sensors made it possible to detect ships the size of light transport at a distance, significantly exceeding the effective range of naval artillery. Small ships, and especially fighters equipped with powerful electronic warfare systems and camouflage fields that turned off their sensors to minimize outgoing radiation, could be well hidden from the sensors. This was done especially well by the heavy ARC-170 Starfighter and RZ-1 A-Wing Interceptor. These fighters and interceptors were equipped with good electronic warfare systems, capable of jamming the sensors of enemy aircraft. But the ISD itself could jam the communications of enemy ships and intercept their exchange of information, which the Imperials actively used when chasing the rebels. In addition to space combat, the Imperial was actively used to support ground forces during landing operations, and could, if necessary, easily carry out the base Delta Zero order. In addition to the ship's armament, an impressive air group nested in the Imperial's main hangar. The standard ISD air group consisted of 6 squadrons of different types, 4 squadrons of TIE fighters, 1 squadron TIE interceptor, and 1 squadron of TIE bombers. There are 72 vehicles in total, 12 in each squadron, plus several TIE's special models. TIE Scout. Later, closer to the Battle of Endor, TIE interceptors became more widespread, and the standard configuration now consisted of 3 fighter squadrons, 2 TIE interceptor squadrons, and 1 bomber squadron. In addition to the above, Alpha-class XG-1 Star Wing could sometimes be located in ISD hangars. There were either none at all, or there were 12 vehicles, 1 squadron, or 6 vehicles, half squadron. At the very beginning of operation of the ISD, the seat of heavy fighters Alpha-class XG-1 Star Wing was occupied by ARC-170s. Instead of TIE vehicles, there were Alpha-3, Nimbus-class V-Wing Starfighter, and Eta-2, Actis-class Light Interceptor. All this Republican equipment had landing supports. Only Nimbus-class could be hung from the ceiling. Because of this, most of the equipment nested on the floor of the hangar. Later adopted TIE vehicle, which was specifically designed to be placed in a suspended state. Only TIE bombers most often sat on the floor leaning on their planes. For bombers on the Imperial was allocated a separate hangar cell in which they were stored along with ammunition for safety. Because if a proton or ion bomb explodes inside the hangar, the whole crew might be in trouble. Other TIE vehicles was located in separate cells on the flight deck, where it was mounted on special ramps under the ceiling with bridges for pilots connected to them. Fighters only went on deck for repairs and maintenance. This allowed mechanics to work with vehicles and equipment on the deck floor and not interfere with the takeoff of pilots on a combat mission. TIE vehicles aboard the ISD take off not manually, but with the help of an autopilot and an automated launch system that carefully guides fighters out of the hangar using small tractor beam projectors. The pilot took control only outside the hangar. The landing was carried out in the same way, including the damaged pennant, of which only the engines, the cockpit, and the pilot inside, gray with fear, remained. Thanks to automation, the Imperial could launch his entire air group into space in just a few minutes. If no more than 6 fighters were landing, they could landing on the floor in the compartment to the left of their cells, here. Then they left their vehicles, and then transporters delivered fighters to their cell. If a large number of vehicles came in to land at once, then they immediately landed. That is, they were suspended on rails in their hangar cells, the configuration of which was not the same on all ISD, and differed depending on the series of the ship. There are several large compartments, but most often fighters and interceptors are located in small compartment cells. Each cell is equipped with an armored door and a force field to retain the atmosphere when the door is open, much like on the Venator. In total, there are from 18 to 22 such cells on the Imperial. Plus, there is a spacious hangar landing deck, also covered with an armored door and a force field. It is designed for shuttles, transport ships, and fighter aircraft with landing legs. A team of mechanics was assigned to each compartment, and each compartment was equipped with the necessary equipment to service the aircraft. There was also a full repair section between the main and cargo hangars for overhauling fighters and shuttles. Nearby, in separate armored and shielded compartments, there was reactor fuel for fighters and shuttles. The hangars are connected to each other by a wide corridor, in which various equipment could also be located. The hangars also had compartments for landing barges, heavy AT-AT walkers, and other things. Both hangars could be used to launch landing shuttles. Due to its size, the main hangar was used to board enemy ships or receive Allied pennants using tractor beam projectors and cranes located under the hangar's ceiling. Like the Venator, the Emperor's hangars had armored doors and could be tightly closed if necessary. When open, the hangars were protected only by a power shield. The ISD was supplied with energy by 2 power plants. The Imperial's main power plant consisted of 3 power units and 3 reactors, 1 main and 2 auxiliary. The second power plant consisted of 1 reactor, the 4th in a row. It was located on the bow of the ship, and being emergency, it was used only in emergency cases. The reactors operated on the principle of solar ionization and thermonuclear fusion. Imperial propaganda claimed that for just 1 hyperjump, the main propulsion plant generated more energy than some civilizations could produce in their entire existence. The presence of 4 reactors at once increased the survivability of the battleship. To completely de-energize the ISD, the enemy would have to pick apart the entire ship. The main reactor, manufactured by CNR, supplied energy to the main components of the ship. It is interesting that Quat's engineers decided to install reactors from a competing company on their ship, although the same Venator had Quat's power plant. First of all, the reactor powered the sustainer ion engines, hyperdrives, power shields, weapons and life support systems. Auxiliary power units powered the ship's secondary systems, from auxiliary and shunting engines to electric kettles in the galley and light bulbs in the cabins. The emergency reactor, also known as the backup reactor, was used only when all the reactors of the main power plant failed at once, or to strengthen the auxiliary reactors when the main reactor was turned off. Alone, the backup reactor could not supply the ISD with enough energy to fight. The emergency power plant was only sufficient for stable operation of the crew's life support systems and partial operation of the engines and hyperdrive. This made it possible to slowly but still remove the damaged ship from the battle zone and deliver it to the nearest base with repair docks. The power supply system included numerous energy cells that accumulated energy from the reactors and could, for some time, help the operation of the emergency reactor. In normal mode, these batteries supplied energy to turbolaser batteries, each of which was a separate semi-autonomous module. This made it possible to avoid energy surges when firing at maximum power, which had a good effect on the operation of the reactor. Thus, the main caliber guns could fire continuously without fear of overheating the reactor. For example, on Venator, the cannons were directly powered by the reactor, without batteries as intermediaries, which had a detrimental effect on the overall combat effectiveness. Also, the presence of energy cells made it possible to fire for some time, even with the reactors completely turned off. An extensive power supply system made it possible to maintain partial combat effectiveness of the ship when hit by volleys of ion cannons. In the Battle of Hoth, the super-powerful V-150 ion cannon took out of the battle ISD Tyrant with a couple of shots. Despite the shutdown of the main reactors and partially burned out electronics, the ship's crew remained alive and well, as the life support systems continued to operate from the emergency reactor and power cells. If such a salvo had hit a ship simpler than the ISD, the crew would have died out faster than the dinosaurs, simply suffocating due to the off-life support system. But the Tyrant even still has gravity on board. Soon, the crew restored the ship's normal power supply, and the Tyrant still managed to take part in the pursuit of the rebels. In general, this ship had a very interesting history. The power plant, along with reactor fuel tanks and various systems that ensure the operation of the ship, occupied a lot of space in the central and aft parts of the ship. In general, at the time of its development, the Imperial's reactor was the largest device in its class. Part of the main power plant extended beyond the hull. It is its dome that is clearly visible in images of the battleship. Despite the significant protrusion of the hull dimensions and the presence of cover only from the air group, the reactor dome was well armored and protected by ISD power shields. Also, the reactor was not tightly secured to the housing. This design solution made it possible to drop the reactor core from the ship in an emergency. In a sense, this can be classified as a weapon. Imagine what an unstable, jettisoned reactor could do if it exploded in the atmosphere or surface of a planet. Such a kind of orbital bombardment will clearly not benefit the planet's ecosystem. Thanks to the reset capability and unique modularity, the repair and replacement of the battleship's power plant was simplified. The ship was propelled by 3 main and 4 auxiliary ion engines. The main engines of the KDY Destroyer 1 model were located entirely inside the ship's hull, immediately behind the power plant, like 4 auxiliary engines of the G-Man 4 model, manufactured by a subcontractor company, Cygnus Spaceworks. All 7 engines had a deflectable thrust vector, which gave the 1.5-kilometer battleship good maneuverability. The maximum ISD speed at full power of all 7 engines was 60 mglt. Yes, in the Star Wars universe, space has its own laws, and ships have their own speed limits. When flying at cruising speed, only the main engines were used. The maneuvering engines were turned on only for active maneuvering in combat or to quickly gain speed. For comparison, some fighters and bombers do not reach a maximum speed of 60 mglt. The Venator has smaller speed limit, 40 mglt. However, small aircraft require several seconds to accelerate, while the Imperial will reach maximum speed for quite a long time. The ISD's atmospheric flight speed was 975 km/h. To remain in the atmosphere, the ISD was equipped with numerous powerful repulsors located along the sides of the hull. Keeping something as large as a Star Destroyer in the air required a lot of energy, so ISDs spent most of their time in space, and they tried not to go into the atmosphere unnecessarily. The ISD engines were well covered by armor and power shields, but due to the inability to fire into the rear hemisphere, the stern of the battleship was quite vulnerable. But it was very difficult to disable or even damage the ISD engines in a linear squadron battle. Much more difficult than the Venator engines sticking out of the hull like an ice cream stick. Also, deep into the hull, under the protection of the armor, the battleship's hyperdrives were mounted. There were two of them, the main Class 2 hyperdrive and the auxiliary Class 8 hyperdrive. Let me remind you that on Venator, the main hyperdrive was Class 1, but the auxiliary one was only Class 15 or 16. Because of this, the ISD flew slower in hyperspace than its predecessor, which sometimes did not allow Imperial to quickly catch up with the rebels. But the auxiliary hyperdrive could, if necessary quite quickly, compared to the Venator, bring the ISD to the nearest repair base. But failure of the main hyperdrive due to combat damage was extremely rare, since in order to get to it, the enemy had to pick apart half of the battleship's hull. The protective field generators, deflectors, are located at the top of the superstructure and are presented in the form of two large spheres. These same spheres are the main deflector projectors of the ship, protecting the captain's bridge. The remaining projectors are located evenly on the ship's hull and project a protective field at a short distance from the hull. The projectors and generator are securely protected. The ISD has two protective field generators. In combat, as a rule, only one of them works. The second one is activated only when the first generator is overloaded or disabled, or in special cases. It is noteworthy that the ISD's shields are weaker than those of the Venator, but this was compensated for by the thickness of the armor and a more thoughtful design, which ultimately significantly increased the survivability of the ship. The captain's bridge is located on the tower superstructure rising above the ship's hull. Navigation, communications, guns, deflectors, air group and airborne units are controlled from the bridge. Wide observation windows provide the captain with a wonderful view of space, but in case of danger they can be covered with meter-thick armor plates, and a holographic display will be activated instead of the windows. The design of the captain's bridge is completely carried over from Venator. The bridge operators are located in two deep niches in the floor. There were places for a pair of navigators, the chief gunner, the main operators of electronic warfare and locators, and a helmsman. Some of the operators, long-distance communications and interception, are located in several cabins behind the bridge. The ISD's captain bridge may seem like the ship's weakest point, but it is true. The superstructure had good armor, and was perfectly covered by power shields, the projectors and generators of which are located on the superstructure itself, model ISD-72X. These are the spheres, development and production of Quat. Long-distance communication antennas and some locators were placed between the shield projectors. The shape of this superstructure differed among Imperials of different generations, but there were first-generation Imperials with a second-generation superstructure. In reality, this was caused by an artist's mistake, but within the universe it is explained by the fact that it was an experimental add-on, which later went into series. There are two ways to get to the captain's bridge. Use the turbolift, or go through the wide sliding door, to the right of which there was a communications post and signalman. To the left was a large holographic projector, which, if necessary, could be separated from the rest of the bridge by a soundproof partition. The sliding door was usually used by ship captains and senior crew officers, since immediately below the bridge on a dozen decks, there were cabins for senior officers, a wardroom, briefing rooms, and other places for officer leisure, where junior ranks rarely appeared. Each captain equipped this corner as he wanted, from a bathhouse or a garden to a museum, like Thrawn. Just in case, the ISD had a backup captain's bridge located deep in the hull. There was an artillery station there, control room, tracking and interception stations, technical departments, and some other combat posts. Also, all these posts were duplicated and spaced along the hull to increase the survivability of the ship. The general direction of the air group's actions took place from the captain's bridge, while the main flight control center was located above the hangar. The takeoff and landing control center was located inside the hangar. Two onboard supercomputers with enormous computing power and artificial intelligence provided great assistance to the bridge staff and the entire crew in controlling the ship. It was a very powerful automated control system that performed millions of computational operations every second, from calculating hyperjump coordinates to calculating the daily food allowance for crew members and diagnosing droids, of which there were also many on the ISD. In the event of a boarding, the onboard computer took over control of the automated defense systems, of course, if any. The room with the main supercomputer was located in the superstructure under the captain's bridge. Depending on the series of the ship, the system administrator's hall was located from 2 to 10 decks below the bridge. The room with the backup supercomputer was located in different places on different ships, usually at the base of the superstructure. But it could also be in the central part, above one of the recreation areas located above the reactors. There were also residential modules above the reactors, gyms, briefing rooms, barracks for stormtroopers, tank crews, and naval infantry soldiers. The pilots lived in cabins with 4 to 6 beds next to the hangar. Squadron commanders had separate cabins. There, in the hangar area, there were cabins for technicians. The senior officers' cabins were located in the bridge area and immediately below it. Along the entire ship there were numerous corridors and turbolifts for the movement of the crew. The ISD had spacious holds with a total capacity of 36,000 metric tons. Food and other supplies for a comfortable life for the crew were stored there. In the bow and stern there were tanks for tens of thousands of tons of water. In the center of the ship there was a water purification station. To feed the thousands of crew members, numerous dining rooms, galleys, and wardrooms are scattered throughout the ship. There are even a few bars staffed by civilians. Also, for the comfort of the crew during long space raids, recreational areas with saunas and swimming pools are provided. Along the ship, there are several first aid posts and a full-fledged hospital, equipped with everything necessary, including medical droids. There were many droids on ISD, from cleaners and cooks to torture and battle droids. To save space, there was no waste recycling system, and all waste was simply dumped into space through a corresponding hole at the stern of the ship. According to instructions, garbage dumping took place before the hyperjump. In each compartment of the ship, there was emergency equipment, including breathing apparatus and in some places even spacesuits, but they were designed for 5,000 to 6,000 main crew members. The ISD's full-time crew numbered 37,085. The standard landing load is a legion of stormtroopers numbering 9,700 people with reinforcements, 20 AT-AT walkers, up to 30 AT-ST walkers, as well as a long list of other armored vehicles, speeder bikes, heavy-mounted blasters, light artillery, and more. In addition, there was still room on the Imperials for 1 or 2 rapid deployment bases, which will be discussed later. As a result, the Imperial's full staff human load was 46,785 people. It turns out to be a small city. You probably have a question, why so much? What could so many people do in ISD? After all, in the same Venator, the crew consisted of only 7,400 sailors and officers, and in the main enemy of the Imperial, on the MC-80 cruisers, there was a crew of 5,000 to 6,000 living sentient beings at different times. And the answer to this question is very simple. The fact is that this is the full, maximum crew of the ISD, which includes not only the sailors and officers of the ship, but also a regiment of naval infantry, up to 2,500 people. Personnel to service this very naval infantry. Personnel to service Stormtroopers Division. For technicians, Imperial security officers, and others. The ship's crew required for full operation was 5,000 to 6,000 people. Therefore, Imperials usually flew with a crew, rarely 10,000 people, taking on board only a battalion of naval infantry and a company or 2 of stormtroopers. The rest of the crew remained at the sector fleet base, where they spent their leisure time. By the way, the ISD in the Imperial fleet is not only a battleship, but also played the role of a universal landing ship. This is why ISD had such a large landing force and rapid deployment base modules. These bases were very interesting things. Landing shuttles delivered modules to the more or less flat surface of the planet, which were usually assembled into a ready-made base in no more than 2 days. This usually took from several hours to several days, depending on the type of base. These bases were used to ensure the security of strategically important facilities, mining complexes, plants, factories, strengthen planetary garrisons, and strengthen the defense of cities. In the event of an Imperial offensive, such bases were the main strongholds of the Imperial Army. On undeveloped planets, garrison bases are home to research groups. Also, a garrison base can be used to develop trade relations with any race and be used for diplomatic purposes. On some planets, garrison bases are used to house especially dangerous criminals. To deliver all this to the planet, the hangars contained a large number of landing shuttles, cargo transporters, and landing barges. In addition to all this, many ISDs had boarding shuttles of various models, such as the Delta-class DX-9 Stormtrooper transport and Gamma-class assault shuttle. The latter were specially built for space landings, taking into account the experience of using Space Marines, Stormtroopers in power armor. Yes, there were those too. In addition to landing troops, Gamma-class shuttles were also sometimes used in space battles to support fighters, as they had very good armor and excellent weapons. Naturally, in the conditions of a huge Imperial fleet numbering 25,000 ISD, all ships couldn't be the same. Due to construction at dozens shipyards, the battleships had some differences. There were low-volume models of the Imperials with such features as expanded or, on the contrary, smaller hangars. A changed configuration of weapons that made the ship a full-fledged battleship like the Tector, improved electronic warfare equipment, reconnaissance ships, and much more. Because of this, their cost also differed, from 100 to 150 million credits. But this ships continued to be Imperial-class ISD. But there were modifications of the ISD that created a new class of ships. Let's talk about them now. You all know well such a ship as the Interdictor-class heavy cruiser, also known as Immobilizer 418. It is equipped with 4 gravity well generators, very interesting devices that create a gravitational field around the interdictor, preventing ships from plunging into hyperspace, and capable of pulling ships already there out of hyper. The ship was very useful, but it had the disadvantage of weak weapons and not very good armor, which is why the interdictors always had to fly with an escort. Can you guess what the engineers decided to do? They decided to make a hybrid, combine interdictor and ISD. The result is this Frankenstein, Imperator-class Star Destroyer. The new ship had excellent armor and shields from the Imperial, good weapons, but not nearly as powerful as those of linear ISDs, and most importantly, it cost 175 million credits, 25 million more than the most expensive serial modification of the Imperials, while the price of the Interdictor-class heavy cruiser was 52 million credits. But the most important thing is that the ship also had to be covered by an escort, since its weapons were not enough to single-handedly confront an enemy thrown out of hyperspace. As a result, very few Interdictor-class Star Destroyers were built. Interestingly, gloomy geniuses were also found in the New Republic. There they built similar ships based on the first-generation Imperials, which were called Mon Mothma. Several of them were built. The Republicans also managed to install gravity wells on Victory Wine-class Star Destroyer. The lead ship of the series was named Admiral Akbar. Both classes of ships appeared after the end of the Galactic Civil War, and already fought with the Yuuzhan Vong. Then they took part in the Swarm War and the Second Galactic Civil War. Stealth battleships were another rarity. Back in the days of the Republic, the CNR Corporation conducted experiments to create ships with optoelectronic camouflage, in other words, stealth. You probably know the TIE Phantoms and the Republican Corvette used in the Battle of Christophsis. What about the invisible battleship? In the Imperial Remnant Fleet, stealth devices received 4 ISD. 3 of them are known: Obliterator, Tyrannic, and Iron Hand. The ships turned out to be truly invisible. No sensor or scanner could detect them, least of all, the human eye. But there was one minus. The fact is that not only did no one see them, but the ship's sensors did not see anything outside the camouflage field. It was absolutely impenetrable, both from the outside and from the inside. To reconnaissance of the surrounding situation, they used observation droids and reconnaissance shuttles, which emerged from under the masked fields like a periscope of a submarine and transmitted information to the ship. Naturally, the sensors of the droids and shuttles were not far away, but it was still better than going blind. According to data received from external observers, the crews of the ships aimed artillery at enemy ships. During the Comma document crisis, 3 battleships almost succeeded in causing a massacre in orbit of Bothawi, where a diplomatic mission was taking place and a large fleet of ships from 2 factions was stationed in orbit. A shot at one ship, at another, and recently the Allied factions are already at war, and the Civil War begins in the New Republic. But the plans of the Imperials were not destined to come true. The ships were discovered. Then Gilad Pellaeon, failing to competently take advantage of the situation to strengthen positions in the negotiations, revealed all his cards to the New Republic. Now let's move on to the completely unique Imperials. Before the famous super laser was installed on the Death Star, the technology was tested at several experimental stations and ships. The first test subject was Twilight, in the 18th year of BBY. In fact, it was a flying carriage for an experimental axial super laser. In horizontal projection, that is, when viewed from above, the ship resembled a pitchfork. In this way, he was similar to the ancient Sith Harrower-class dreadnought. It turned out successfully. The cannon was successfully tested in an attack on an Astrodyne base, where several Jedi were hiding, along with a small organization of rebels. Twilight took part in battles several more times, and then was sent for mothballing. What happened to this ship after that is unknown. Based on ISD, another experimental stand was built with a more powerful super laser. The ship was named Conqueror, and the officer firing the blaster was Admiral Victor Strange, project manager for the creation of Conqueror Ship Commander. Structurally, the ship was very similar to Twilight. The shape of the turbolaser and its effectiveness differed. Rebel Alliance intelligence discovered the ship, and the Renegade Special Forces carried out a very risky sabotage operation and destroyed the ship from the inside. There is another ship that has little in common with the ISD, but is built from its modules. The Starhawk-class battleship appeared in new canon, and was built by the New Republic at the Rendley shipyards shortly after the Battle of Endor. Despite the lack of visual similarity, Starhawk-class are built from modules intended for ISD, and sometimes from what is left of ISD. Battleships managed to take part at the end of the Galactic Civil War. In particular, 3 Starhawk classes fought in the Battle of Jakku. Their names are Unity, Concord, and Amity. The last 2 were destroyed in the battle for the planet. During development, Lyra Wessex envisioned the Imperials flying with an escort that would cover their weak points, such as the stern and lower hemisphere during combat. But the Imperial naval commanders thought differently. As we have often seen, ISDs fly without any escort ships. The Imperial captains believed that they had such enormous power in their hands that no one would dare attack them. This played a cruel joke on many battleships. During operation, ISD flew alone or in small groups of 2 to 3 ships. Less often, squadrons of 6 battleships were assembled. The power of the ISD's weapons made it possible to single-handedly confront an entire squadron of rebels. But for reliability, several ISDs were sometimes assembled during combat missions. Thanks to its arsenal, the Imperial II class could, with some luck, single-handedly defeat 2 Mon Calamari heavy cruisers, MC-80 project. But it was quite dangerous. For example, in the game Jedi Academy there is a case where 3 MC-80 cruisers were able to destroy an ISD. Throughout the history of ISD operation, there have been many cases of battleships being boarded, and not only from the rebels, but also from the Empire remnants, in order to return the ship back to its rightful owner. Boarding a ship with a crew of 36,000 people is extremely difficult, and if the ISD was transporting a legion of stormtroopers, then the invaders could have very serious problems. However, even with a crew of 5,000 to 6,000 souls, the battleship was not an easy target. To board a ship, the first thing you need to do is infiltrate it. The most obvious and most dangerous option was the hangar. There are always numerous personnel there with personal small arms, and stormtroopers often appear. In addition, walkers can organize a warm welcome for the boarding party. The second way to penetrate the ship was through numerous docking points and technical hatches scattered throughout the hull, but a sufficient number of boarders would not be able to quickly pass through them to capture vital points, which are discussed below. The most interesting way to get on board the ISD was through the garbage disposal compartment. Legends and the new canon describe many cases where boarders boarded a ship through this weak spot. The main thing is not to stay there for too long, as ISD can throw off all the guests during the next garbage disposal. The boarding scenario was as follows. The first step is to destroy, disperse it, or in any other way remove the ship's escort from the battle. Then a boarding group lands in the area of the superstructure and gets on board using one of the above methods. Next, the boarders have the task of taking control of the main points of the ship, by capturing which they can gain control over the entire battleship. There were 4 of them. In order of importance, the engine room with the 3 main power units of the reactor compartment. Then, the captain's bridge. Then, the hall with the central supercomputer, and finally, the reserve captain's bridge. After their capture, it was possible to dictate your will to the rest of the crew. It was possible to euthanize the remaining members of the ship's crew by reducing the amount of oxygen in the battleship's compartments, or remove oxygen completely, if the people who took control of ISD were not distinguished by their humanity. Of course, the remnants of the crew could try to start the reserve reactor, which would ensure the operation of life support systems, and then make their way long and hard through closed bulkheads to the uninvited guests. But this was only possible if at least the reserve bridge remained under the control of the crew. Otherwise, the ship's personnel could only rely on emergency kits of breathing apparatus and spacesuits. But they were designed for 5,000 to 6,000 people, and they would not have been enough for a long time. Stormtroopers and some naval infantry units had internal oxygen reserves in their suits, but they were enough for no more than 30 minutes of active activity. In addition, if the boarders took control of the central supercomputer, the crew could encounter automated defense systems of their own ship. When even your own walls are against you, this does not add enthusiasm to the battle. But the boarding party still needed to capture all these important points. For a successful operation, it was necessary to act quickly, brazenly, and decisively, having in stock a lot of grenades, explosives, laser cutters, and knowledge of the ship's layout. If the crew managed to come to their senses and organize a defense, the attackers got into serious trouble. It is to counter a possible boarding that the crew, naval infantry soldiers and stormtroopers, always carry personal weapons on the ISD. This made it possible to quickly respond to the emerging threat. During the battle, stormtroopers and naval infantrymen scattered to pre-designated combat posts, rather than sitting idly in barracks. Before the Battle of Endor, the rebels very rarely captured the ISD, as such an operation required a lot of effort, and Imperial intelligence could quickly determine the location of the hijacked ship. Therefore, the Alliance more often carried out sabotage operations to destroy ships of the Empire, and it was in such peculiar battles that many ISDs were lost. But such success also required a strong strain of resources, which is why sabotage did occur, but not too often. The most difficult thing for the rebels during the Galactic Civil War was to destroy the ISD in a head-on collision. Even if successful, the Empire lost 1 or 2 ships and tens of thousands of people, but this was not a great loss for the Empire. But for the rebels, such a victory could bring too many losses that the Alliance could not make up for. Therefore, there were almost no large space battles during the Rebellion era. The Battle of Scarif and several major battles immediately after Yavin clearly showed the Alliance leadership the futility of such a fight on an ongoing basis. As a result, the ISD rarely participated in linear space combat, but they had plenty to do in the early years following the Clone Wars, when a series of major offensives against CIS worlds called the Outer Rim Reconquista were launched. In those battles, the ISD, along with the Venators and other Republic equipment, performed admirably. After the victory over the Separatists, uprisings constantly broke out in different parts of the galaxy in the young Imperial state, which the ISD proved to be the best in suppressing. Their numerous troops landed on the planet under the cover of an air group and powerful naval artillery. The naval units responded quite quickly to the threat that arose, since the number of ISDs that came into operation made it possible to equip almost all the fleets of the Empire with them. But there were sectors in which ISD did not exist at all, and where they were only seen on Imperial propaganda products. For example, the Kandorus and Bakura sectors. The Empire's standard sector fleet consisted of at least 2,400 ships, of which 1,600 were combat ships, ranging from corvettes to battleships. The remaining 800 are all kinds of supply ships. Of the 2,400 ships, 24 were ISD. That is, for each Imperial, there were 100 escort and supply ships. In many important systems of the Empire, The sector fleet exceeded the 2,400 ship mark, and sometimes reached 5,000 pennants, that is, 50 ISD in one sector. For example, Kuat in his sector at the time of the Battle of Endor had 60 Imperial-class and more than 100 Victory-class Star Destroyers. The total strength of the Kuat sector fleet reached 6,000 ships of all types and classes, not including the ships that were at the shipyards in varying degrees of combat readiness. Immediately after the collapse of the Empire and the emergence of the New Republic, clashes between the Imperials and the Republicans did not become very violent. But with a bright flame in the 5th year after Battle of Yavin, an internecine war broke out between the Imperial remnants, in which entire fleets of the once powerful state were burned. Now the Imperials were at war with their sister ship, the same ISD, under the leadership of various Imperial remnants, who entered into an internecine war for the legacy of the Empire. The New Republic began a smooth advance deep into Imperial territories only 6 months after Endor, with the systematic capture of the worlds of the Middle and Inner Rings, including Coruscant. After the New Republic captured the galactic capital, the Galactic Civil War has gained new momentum. Now the ISDs were at war with all their might against the New Republic fleet, which attracted thousands of warships to the battles, including captured ISDs, which after Endor were much more actively boarded and captured by Republican commandos. The end of the Imperial Civil War was brought about by Admiral Natasi Da'ala in 12th year after Battle of Yavin, with the support of some influential officers, including Pelion, united scattered small states into a single Imperial remnant, which, in the fragment itself, they preferred to proudly call the Empire. After 6 years of low-intensity battles on the border in the year 19, after Battle of Yavin, peace was concluded, marking the end Galactic Civil War with the signing of a peace treaty between the then head of the New Republic, Ponch Gaverso, and the head of the United Imperial Remnant, Gilad Pellaeon. During the war from the Empire has only 1,000 planetary systems left, and 200 ISD remain from the once powerful fleet. In total, the Remnant's military fleet consisted of about 2,000 warships and auxiliary vessels. There were approximately 250 additional ISDs in the New Republic Navy. It turns out that during internecine clashes and in battles with the New Republic, about 98% of all Imperial-class burned down. Imperial Remnant continued to build ISDs, but due to budget and raw material shortages, the ships were built slowly. The ISD's role as the main combat ship gradually diminished. The New Republic launched a massive program to radically renew its fleet. Within its framework, new main ships of all classes were created, from corvettes to battleships. One of them was the Nebula-class Star Destroyer. It was a real battleship. Being 1.5 times smaller, the Nebula-class was superior to both generations of ISD in open combat. As you remember, the ISD was a universal ship. During its development, these were exactly what was needed. But after 3 decades, the main advantage of the Imperial-class became its disadvantage. The New Republic decided to create a full-fledged battleship. To do this, everything unnecessary was removed from the ship: hangars, landing space, and other things that were not needed in linear squadron combat. Only a regiment of naval infantry remained on the Nebula-class to board and protect the ship from boarding. But the Nebula-class was full of artillery. The modularity of the Nebula-class design also made it possible to create an Endurance-class fleet carrier based on it. Another additional New Republic battleship developed under a separate program was Republic-class Star Destroyer. Its weapons were 20% superior to those of the Imperial-1-class Star Destroyer, and just as inferior to those of the Imperial-2-class Star Destroyer. But the main thing for the New Republic was half the cost of production, and 3 times less cost of service Republic-class. It is noteworthy that the ship was designed with the participation of Valix Blissex, and it was produced by Rendili Star Drive, who nevertheless received their share of the shipbuilding market. First, let's consider the fundamental possibility of the Star Destroyer from Star Wars existing in an unchanged form in our universe, according to the laws of physics. Let's start with the hyperdrive. Since this is one of the main components in the design of a ship, and without it, any large ship in the galaxy far, far away becomes almost meaningless. As we know, humanity has been actively thinking for a long time, more than 50 years, about the idea of a device capable of covering distances of many light years in an acceptable time. And it not only thinks, but also tries to implement it. No, not in practice, but in theory. At the moment, the most realistic concept for such a unit is warp drive technology, the development history of which goes back 30 years this year. However, despite some advances in theoretical physics, warp drive is still just a concept, bordering on science fiction. At least the possibility of its existence is allowed. Moreover, even if humanity is able to build a working instance of a warp engine, its power will clearly not be enough to move such a massive object like a Star Destroyer through space. Even for Venator or Victory class, whose length is 1.5 times less than that of Imperial. Thus, at the moment, hyperdrive technology for terrestrial science appears to be decisively impossible in our universe. But what about conventional engines? The vast majority of Star Wars ships have ion engines. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer has 3 main and 4 maneuvering ion engines. And with this technology, everything is much more interesting. Ion engines belong to a subclass of electrostatic rocket engines, which in turn belong to the class of electric engines. That is, the ion engine is just one representative of a whole family of engines. As their name implies, ion engines work using the principle of repulsion between particles of the same charge. Let's briefly consider the essence of their work. Many different substances are used as fuel, but most often it is gas. Xenon. Gas is ionized by various methods. Most often, this is electronic bombardment. Positively charged ionic substances fly out of the nozzle at a very high speed, due to which thrust is created that sets the spacecraft in motion. This is a very simplified explanation. In parallel with this, several other important processes occur, but they do not affect the essence, and we will not consider them. The most important thing is that such engines are quite real not only in theory, but also in practice. And more, they have been widely used in the space industry for 50 years. First of all, the main advantage of such engines is the highest specific impulse among all modern engines. And also, high efficiency, 80%. But such engines also have a significant drawback: very little thrust compared to conventional jet engines. However, with further development of technology, it may be possible to create ion engines whose power will be similar to the engines of Star Destroyers from the movie's universe. Thus, the Imperial engines are quite real, and are capable of existing in our universe. It is also worth mentioning that in the Star Wars universe there are restrictions on the maximum speed of ships in space, such as the physics of the galaxy far, far away. As you yourself understand perfectly well, in our universe there are simply no such restrictions. More precisely, there is a limit on the speed of light. But firstly, it is the same for all physical objects in the universe that have mass. And secondly, you still need to accelerate to such a high speed. However, in theory, Imperial's powerful engines are capable of approaching near light speed quite quickly. In general, in our world, Star Destroyers would not have the same speed restrictions as in their native universe. By the way, the speed of the Venator-class Star Destroyer in the atmosphere is 975 km/h, the speed of modern airliners. Also in our universe there can be, and even already exist, repulsors. In Star Wars, repulsors are used by almost all types of military and civilian equipment, both ground and space. Ships use repulsors primarily to maintain such massive machines in the atmosphere, and to achieve a soft landing. Naturally, if the ship is intended for landing. For example, Imperial was developed without the ability to land on a planet. The Venator, or even more so, the Acclamator, which is a landing ship, has such an opportunity. The repulsors of all these ships are located in large numbers along the edges of the hull, to evenly distribute the load, and to avoid a situation where the ship simply breaks under the force of gravity, due to the incorrect configuration of the anti-gravs. By the way, in general, it is not correct to call repulsors anti-gravs, since they do not affect gravity. If you have watched other videos about the realism of certain Star Wars vehicles, for example the video about the LAAT gunship, then you know how repulsors work. This technology is based on Newton's third law and ionization of the environment through electrical interaction. In our case, the repulsor grids, through which current flows, ionize the air under the ship, and charged gas particles fly down from the ship at very high speed. This creates lifting force. And as you may already know, this technology is being actively developed and is already being used to create ion drones. For example, Silent Ventus drone. A little more detail is described in the video about the AAT tank and the LAAT gunship in the corresponding chapters. Thus, repulsor technology is quite possible. But do not forget that in order to operate such powerful repulsors and engines that drive and hold gigantic ships in the atmosphere, you will need an extremely powerful power plant, an energy supply system. That is, the ship's reactors and batteries, as well as related systems. And all this raises big questions, as it is known that the Star Destroyers have hyper-material reactors that produce an unprecedentedly large amount of energy compared with our civilization. For example, the total power of all three Imperator-class Star Destroyer reactors is 3.6 yottawatt, 3.6 per 10 to 24 degrees watt. The power of a small and weak star. To understand how much this is, the total radiation power of our Sun is estimated at 382.7 yottawatt, and the total power of all Earth's nuclear power plants is 390 gigawatts. That is, at full power, the Venator reactor generated energy only 106 times less than the Sun, and almost 1 trillion times more than our civilization. First of all, such prohibitively high performance of the reactors of Star Wars ships is due to the use of so-called hypermatter as fuel, a substance that simply does not exist in our universe. More precisely, it is not known to modern science, and there are no theoretical grounds for its existence. However, the closest analog of hypermatter may be antimatter, the existence of which has been scientifically confirmed, in contrast to dark matter, another potential analog of hypermatter. Back in 1965, the first artificially induced formation of antimatter atoms occurred. In theory, it is precisely when using such fuel, or rather when antimatter interacts with matter in a 1-to-1 ratio and in a relatively small amount, that the necessary amount of energy will be released for the operation of kilometer-long space combat ships. It can also be assumed that the hypermatter from the Star Wars universe is precisely antimatter, but this is unlikely, since in the galaxy far, far away, hypermatter can be found in its natural form. That is, without the direct intervention of intelligent beings. For example, in the Red Hearn star system, the formation of hypermatter was a product of the interaction of the planetary core and the radiation emitted by the star. One way or another, we can equate hypermatter with antimatter and conclude that Star Destroyer reactors are real from a physics point of view. Another thing is that due to improper use during the interaction of matter with antimatter, such an amount of energy can be released that will lead to an explosion and simply destroy the ship. But for this purpose, there are appropriate protection systems designed to prevent such a catastrophic incident. In general, we can conclude that the reactors of Star Destroyers in general and Venator or Imperial in particular, although with some assumptions, are real under the conditions of our physical laws and understanding of the universe. In addition to engines and a hyperdrive, such powerful reactors were required for the Star Destroyer's weapons. The main caliber of the Imperial, like most other cruisers and battleships, was turbolasers. In particular, heavy turbolaser guns, XX-9. To understand the degree of realism of this type of weapon, let's look at its technical description. The turbolaser was the immensely scaled-up version of the blaster and laser cannon. These weapons were generally mounted on rotating turrets, which were commonly installed in banks on capital ships, space stations, and orbital facilities. Some immobile variants, like those housed within defense towers of the city of Isis, were used on the ground. Agrosite, an extremely rare ore that was found only on Korm and Simicadia, was known to greatly enhance a turbolaser's destructive power. Merconite was also used in the production of heavy turbolasers. The turbolaser was a heavy laser cannon equipped with large banks of capacitors, allowing it to build up and store far more powerful energy bursts than a standard cannon. They also helped power the galvan coils in the barrels of turbolasers. First, a particle beam was generated in the manner standard for blasters and laser cannons. Then power was increased by guiding this laser cannon particle beam through another stream of energized Tibanna gas, besides the one used in generating the initial beam. The extra capacitors in a turbolaser that stored huge amounts of raw energy then contributed to the beam by energizing it further as it moved to the turbolaser's barrel. The resulting beam carried 2 or more times the energy of a standard laser cannon beam. It then passed through a set of galvan coils located in the turbolaser's barrel, further increasing the beam's power and allowing it to pierce the defenses of heavily protected targets. Because these weapons required extra time to build up energy for their powerful blasts, they tended to have a slightly slower rate of fire than their weaker brethren, usually around 1 to 2 seconds, between volleys, depending on the type of turbolaser and its power setting. The risk of overheating was high due to this massive energy buildup, and many turbolaser models were protected with complex cryo systems and a powerful cooling sleeve on the barrel. The principle of operation of turbolasers described above does not contain aspects that make it fundamentally impossible for such weapons to exist in our world. At least our screenwriter enthusiast thinks so. Yes, this is a very complex device that requires enormous cost to create, but it is still based on technologies and physical laws known to us. The tractor beams of Star Destroyers and other ships are also quite real. They are based on the principle of electromagnetic interaction. The powerful electromagnetic field created by the beam generator attracts or repels the desired object. This technology, albeit in miniature, is already in use today. It's essentially a magnet, a huge, focused magnet. And since Star Destroyers fly mainly in space, that is, in the absence of gravity, the requirements for the power of tractor beams are reduced, which makes them even more realistic. But what now seems impossible is a force shield, which is the main defense of Star Destroyers and other large ships in Star Wars. Allows ships to be under enemy fire without receiving hull damage. In Star Wars, there are two main types of shields used by ships: deflector and corpuscular. The deflector shield protects against energy weapons, plasma and laser shots, radiation, and other things. The corpuscular shield protects from physical objects, asteroids, metal shells, shrapnel, and other things, including enemy kamikaze fighters. Also in the galaxy far, far away, force fields of various types are actively used to retain the atmosphere in an open hangar in space, and to create a barrier, for example, in prisons and other protected facilities. By its physical nature, all this is an electromagnetic field. Undoubtedly, research in this direction has been ongoing since the last century, and something has been achieved. For example, the creation of a force gateway based on a plasma window, which will allow physical objects to pass through but will retain the atmosphere. That is, an analog of the force field that is used in ship hangars. The technology was developed and patented back in 1995. But this is never the same protective force field installed on warships in Star Wars. It may take hundreds of years before the invention of full-fledged protective fields, and this is the case if such technology is in principle possible in our world. But even if the very possibility of creating a force field is possible, it is not at all a fact that it will look and even work the way it is shown in the films. In any case, this is a very controversial and interesting aspect of the realism of Star Destroyers. It will be very interesting to hear your opinion on this in the comments. As part of today's analysis, we will focus on the conclusion that for modern science, protective force fields remain fantasy and seem impossible. But what may be quite possible is the usual armor of ships from which the hull of Star Destroyers is made. The exact composition of the alloy from which the battleship's plating is made is unknown. Nevertheless, we can safely say that this is a very strong material, both by the standards of our civilization and by the standards of Star Wars. The armor plates of Star Destroyers are capable of withstanding hits from turbolaser charges, albeit for a limited time. And even one such charge can melt an ice block with a diameter of 1,000 kilometers. Creating such a strong alloy is an extremely difficult task for modern terrestrial science. Materials known to mankind are unlikely to be suitable, since their strength may not be enough. Nevertheless, the existence of the necessary materials in our universe is quite possible. It is also possible, although unlikely, to create the desired alloy from substances already known to scientists. One way or another, such strong armor is not fundamentally impossible, and it does not contradict the known laws of physics, so that the armor of Star Destroyers can be considered quite real. The same applies to the materials from which the frame and internal compartments of the ship are made. An important role in the functioning of Star Destroyers is played by the onboard computer, equipped with advanced artificial intelligence. Imperial's electronic brains perform millions of computational operations every second. They are involved in almost all the activities of the battleship, from the fire control system and calculating hyperjump coordinates, to managing the cleaning droids in the galley. For all these operations, the onboard computer is equipped with enormous computing power, and there are no obstacles to the existence of such powerful servers in our reality. The only question that arises here is devices for navigation in hyperspace. The principle of their operation and the source of data is completely unclear. Terrestrial science does not know the appropriate forms of mathematical and physical equations for such calculations. It is also completely unclear how navigation is carried out already during a hyperjump. Here it is worth returning to the previously mentioned warp engine. In the concept of its application, navigation and even movement control is carried out from outside the ship, outside the Alcubierre bubble. That is, navigators are located in normal space at the starting and ending points of the ship's movement. However, the crews of Star Wars ships completely independently control the movement of the vessel and all calculations, which, as you understand, is impossible. Imperial is also equipped with a huge amount of other smart hardware, various scanners and sensor systems that scan ordinary space. In essence, this is the further development of modern earthly technologies. So they are quite real. In general, with the exception of hyperspace navigation devices, the electronic content of Star Destroyers is quite real. But the ships from the galaxy far away have some other very interesting devices, such as gravity generators and inertial compensators. Their role is to slow down ships and create gravity on board the ship, as well as maintaining the structural integrity of the ship, so that it does not simply fall apart during a sudden maneuver. The principle of their operation is unclear, and it is not clear whether such units are even possible in our world. So they can safely be assigned the status unreal. We can summarize that in general, the Imperial-class Star Destroyer can exist in our universe, but with a number of restrictions. Namely, the ship will not have a hyperdrive and a deflector shield, which significantly reduces its combat characteristics. It will be possible to forget about flights across the entire galaxy, due to the lack of a hyperdrive. But thanks to powerful ion engines, the Imperial will be able to make interstellar flights at near light speed. For example, like the Venture starship from James Cameron's Avatar movies universe. The lack of deflectors will make the ship much more vulnerable to both weapons and asteroids. The maneuverability of the ship will also be significantly reduced due to the lack of gravitational generators and inertial compensators. But Star Destroyer's weapons will remain the same power, like many other tactical and technical characteristics of the ship. Now let's see if modern humanity can independently build such a ship. How difficult will it be to produce ship modules, and how will they be delivered into space? Naturally, first of all, it will be necessary to build the frame of the ship, from numerous openwork structures on which the internal compartments and hull will be mounted. Most likely, due to the lack of our civilization at this stage of development of industrial infrastructure in space, be it orbital factories, shipyards and factories, and mining complexes on asteroids, the construction of the Star Destroyer will proceed as follows. Relatively small modules will be produced on the surface of our planet. Then they will be transported into Earth orbit and into outer space, where the ship will be assembled from individual modules, like a construction set. Naturally, sending many thousands of tons of cargo into space for the modern space industry will cost a lot of money. Because of this, the total price of cargo delivery can exceed several times the cost of building the ship itself. However, this can be solved by the further development of the space industry. Namely, new ways of sending ships and cargo into space. With the help of electromagnetic catapults, which are already being actively developed and may begin to function in the coming decades. This will allow us to reduce the costs of sending everything we need into space by orders of magnitude. In general, it is the high cost of takeoff from the surface of the planet that is currently the key factor holding back truly active space exploration by mankind. One way or another, the cost of transporting finished modules into orbit will be significantly reduced in the next half-century. What will have the best impact on the construction of the Star Destroyer? By the way, why a ship cannot be built on the surface of the planet? Firstly, this is still much easier to do in space due to the lack of gravity. Secondly, if you build and assemble the Imperial entirely on the surface of the planet, then for it to take off, you will need colossally powerful engines and repulsors. In addition, the takeoff of such a massive object from the surface can lead to a powerful earthquake or a number of other natural disasters. Therefore, the most rational thing would be to assemble the ship in high orbit and in space, as is done in Star Wars. Unless, in films, this happens in specially equipped shipyards. In our case, The assembly process will take place in outer space, since the creation of the necessary full-fledged shipyard will cost even more than the ship itself. Of course, if humanity decides to build an entire fleet of space combat ships, such shipyards will be necessary. But for a single Star Destroyer, such construction would be irrational. What about the required amount of material and production capacity? The largest ships of our time do not exceed 500 meters in length, and the length of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer is 1,600 meters. The modern shipbuilding industry launches hundreds of different ships every year, from small yachts to huge container ships and military aircraft carriers. So, in theory, the production capacity of our planet will be enough to build the frame, hull, and modules for the Imperial in a reasonable time. That is, in 6 months, a year. Especially when producing many different modular compartments of a space battleship at the same time. A few more words about the scale of production. Further comparison will be very unscientific and approximate, but still. In general, in size, Imperial is approximately equal to the 20 aircraft carriers of the U.S. Navy Gerald R. Ford. So the approximate cost of building the Imperial can be estimated at least $260 billion. And most likely the final price will be many times higher. Firstly, due to the cost of transporting modules into orbit. Even if using the latest technologies, reducing costs tenfold. Secondly, due to the need for the development and construction of unique systems and equipment, for example, an antimatter reactor, engines that are gigantic by our standards, and so on. Thus, the price of one Imperial-class Star Destroyer can reach approximately $1 trillion. Of course, this is a very rough estimate. To calculate the exact cost of such a project, it is necessary to involve specialists in the relevant fields. But we can still assume that the price tag of one earthly Imperial will be in the trillions of dollars. But let's take a closer look at the possible difficulties in producing the ship's main systems. First of all, let's look at the reactor, because all ship systems depend on it, which simply will not work without power supply, which is why a formidable military battleship can turn into a useless, very expensive and huge metal piece of pizza, drifting in space. It is the antimatter reactor, and not the weapons or engines, that is the most complex component of a spacecraft. First of all, for a full power supply and operation of a half-kilometer battleship, a huge amount of antimatter is needed. The meeting of 1 gram of antimatter with 1 gram of matter can result in the release of energy in the amount of 180 trillion joules, which is equivalent to 50 gigawatts of power. 50 by 10 to the 9th power. And the Venator-class Star Destroyer reactor has a power of 3.6 by 10 to the 24th watts. Thus, to achieve the maximum power of the Venator reactor, we need approximately 100 million tons of antimatter. As you understand, such an amount of fuel will be orders of magnitude greater than the size of the battleship itself. And here there are two options. Either the authors of the reference books for Star Wars films, to put it mildly, overestimated the power figures of the Venator reactors, which is quite likely, since the Venator can hardly consume so much energy, or a hypermatter reactor is orders of magnitude more powerful than a reactor of similar dimensions and with a similar mass of antimatter fuel. Most likely, both theories are right at once. By the way, according to a 1999 estimate, 1 gram of antihydrogen would cost $62 trillion. One way or another, the Star Destroyer of our civilization will require much less energy than ships from the galaxy far, far away. But even so, using antimatter as fuel will not only be unreasonably expensive, but also simply impossible in the near future, due to the too small scale of antimatter production on Earth. In the coming decades, thermonuclear reactors will come into widespread use, the development of which is considered a priority in the energy industry. Fusion reactors use hydrogen isotopes as fuel, roughly speaking, water. Because of this, their use will be very cheap. The Imperial has space to accommodate a power plant, consisting of several thermonuclear reactors, the total power of which will allow the ship to supply the required amount of energy for life support systems, engines, and weapons. Let me remind you that our Star Destroyer will not have a hyperdrive, which will significantly reduce the ship's energy consumption. Thus, it is thermonuclear reactor blocks that are the most technically feasible way to supply energy to a ship. But this will only be possible in a few decades, when the technology of thermonuclear reactors becomes widespread, whereas now all such installations are experimental. In addition to the direct power plant from the reactors, the battleship's energy supply system consists of numerous energy cells and storage devices, huge 10-meter batteries that accumulate excess energy from the reactor and ensure an uninterrupted supply of weapons in battle when firing at maximum power. Conventional lithium-ion batteries are quite suitable for this role. On the 1.5-kilometer Imperial, there is enough space to place batteries in the required quantity. A very controversial aspect of the Star Destroyer will be its weaponry, turbolaser cannons. These are quite real devices from a physical point of view, and the first models of such weapons are already undergoing field tests, namely experimental laser weapons. The main obstacle to creating full-fledged laser, plasma, and turbolaser guns is the required amount of energy to fire a shot. Requires the power of a full-fledged reactor. But the most interesting thing is that the Star Destroyer will actually have a power plant consisting of several thermonuclear reactors. The dimensions of the batteries of turbolaser guns will allow them to accommodate the necessary systems for converting gas into plasma, creating a powerful electromagnetic field, and cooling, preventing overheating of the guns, and allowing them to fire at high speed. Space, namely vacuum, is the best environment for the use of turbolaser weapons, which in their physical structure are plasma charges. And plasma in dense layers of the atmosphere quickly dissipates, which makes blasters extremely ineffective weapons in a dense environment. In space, concentrated plasmoids will also be dispersible, but the range of effective fire will be much higher than on the surface of atmospheric planets. Tractor beam projectors will also perform best in the absence of gravity in space, making them more efficient. Thus, the Star Destroyer is an excellent object for installing energy weapons on it, thanks to its powerful power supply systems and the large size of the ship, allowing it to install everything necessary. Similarly with ion engines, the power they require will be provided by reactors and related systems, which occupy most of the internal space of the ship. Except that the engines themselves would look different. For maximum efficiency, the nozzles of electric engines would have a small diameter, which increases the specific impulse of the emitted particles. What about the onboard computer and other smart hardware? The Star Destroyer has enough space to accommodate servers with enormous processing power, capable of controlling the ship's automated processes. Artificial intelligence, which is currently being actively developed and is used in this video, will play a significant role in this. Numerous multi-band sensor systems can also be installed on the Imperial in large quantities. The armor and plating of the ship will be made of standard alloys used in astronautics, aluminum alloys. Yes, the development and production of all this will require enormous costs, as well as quite a lot of time to develop the necessary technologies. But nevertheless, this project is quite realistic for implementation in the coming decades, when humanity has the necessary technologies for the relatively cheap and fast delivery of building materials into space, and the creation of all the necessary modules, such as the power plant and weapon systems. Thus, we can say that the construction of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer will become possible by the middle of the 21st century, approximately 2050s, 60s. But in addition to the practical possibility of building such a facility, there is also the question of feasibility. In fact, this is precisely what explains why such projects are not implemented and are not seriously considered. As you understand, there is simply no point in building a 1.5-kilometer military spacecraft at the present time, and there will not be until humanity leaves the solar system. And even then, warships are unlikely to exceed a few hundred meters in size. Large sizes are simply irrational. Thus, the construction of the Star Destroyer is only of cultural value, as a symbol of technological development and the power of our civilization, and also as a symbol of stupidity. And now we will take a closer look at the rationality, or rather the irrationality, of the design of Star Destroyers, and the reason why in the future, even with a sufficient level of industrial and scientific development, such ships will not be built. Let's start with the basis of any transport, with engines, or rather, with their configuration and location. Look carefully. All Star Destroyer engines are concentrated at the stern of the ship, and their nozzles are directed against the direction of the starship. One way. In space conditions and the absence of resistance, Such engines can only accelerate the ship, and it is completely unclear how the spaceship will slow down and generally maneuver. In the galaxy far, far away, an inertial compensator and engine reverse were used for this. It is not entirely clear how such a reverse works. Probably, in this mode, the engines attract ions that were released earlier to the ship, or they somehow magically influenced quantum fields in a vacuum, which would give the same effect. Thus, the ship would move backwards. In our world, interactions with quantum fields of this kind are similar to warp drive technologies, which we have recognized as unreal. Yes, Star Wars ships have shunting engines. In the Venator, all engines are equipped with a full-fledged deflectable thrust vector, like modern fighters of many armies of the world. But such engines are only auxiliary, and partially solve the problems of maneuvering, while the problem with braking remains the same. If in reality we use the same engines configuration, then to slow down the ship we will have to make a 180-degree turn around the vertical axis of the ship. That is, the ship will begin to fly stern first, and only in this way will the engines be able to begin braking. As you understand, this is very difficult and involves great risks. That's why no one will build like that. The correct solution would be to place engines in equal numbers at the stern and bow of the ship, as well as along the sides for maneuvering. For example, this is exactly the configuration that is used on the ISS and other space stations and devices. And in science fiction, Star Fury from Babylon 5 had such engines. Another solution would be to create rotatable motors located outside the hull, on structures capable of turning the motors 180 degrees. Essentially, instead of turning the entire ship, only the engines will turn. For example, this is exactly the mechanism used on the already mentioned Venture Star ship from the Avatar cinematic universe. So, we sorted out the engines. The next biggest oddity of almost all Star Wars ships, and especially Star Destroyers, is the Captain's Bridge, located in a hefty superstructure that protrudes significantly from the hull, and which is missing only a neon-lit target with a shoot here arrow. Imperial is almost a record holder in this regard, but even it was surpassed by the Providence-class carrier Star Destroyer. One of these ships was the flagship of the Commander-in-Chief of the Separatist Forces, General Grievous, in the third episode in the battle over Coruscant. These ships had a huge superstructure, which amounted to half the entire height of the ship, with a captain's bridge located on top, which is the height of engineering idiocy. Such a contraption could easily crash into an allied ship. But all these ships have at least an armored captain's bridge. The Munificent-class frigates' bridges can even be penetrated by light fighter guns. This is described in the corresponding detailed video on the channel. In general, the superstructures and captain's bridges of warships in Star Wars are extremely irrational. In reality, the bridge, being a vital control element of the ship, will first be carried deep into the hull, approximately into the center of the ship, under the protection of armor and many compartments with their internal lining, equipment, the ship's frame, and bulkheads. Panoramic sides of the bridges, more reminiscent of observation deck on ships of past eras, may only be appropriate for civil space liners, yachts, and other civilian vessels. In this case, even panoramic bridge windows, reminiscent of those on airships, would be quite appropriate. Speaking of portholes, they will simply not be needed if there are high-tech means of monitoring the environment. All kinds of scanners and sensors, including CCTV cameras. All these external surveillance systems will broadcast an excellent quality picture directly to the captain's bridge, control room, and other compartments of the ship. This will make it possible to get rid of portholes, which, even being made of transparent types of metal that are not inferior to conventional plating in strength, complicate the design of the ship. On a military ship, such excesses may be completely contraindicated, due to a decrease in structural strength and the overall survivability of the ship. In general, the entire design of the ship in reality raises many questions. The iconic wedge-shaped design of the battleship is due to the possibility of creating such a weapon configuration to allow firing from all barrels at once along the ship's heading, which increases the density of fire in a linear battle when ships move head-on. But similar results can be achieved with a different ship design by placing the guns in special sponsons, carriages, and towers that do not overlap each other's sector of fire. Also, a few words about the Imperial's hangar. In general, such a large gate makes sense, allowing corvettes and landing shuttles to enter directly onto the side of the battleship. The presence of a second hangar entrance allows you to avoid overloading the work of the main hangar. Considering the role of the Imperial as a universal combat ship, capable of transporting a division of stormtroopers with reinforcements and an impressive space group, such a hangar is justified. In any ship, the crew plays an important role, about which not a word was said today. In Star Wars, ships have oversized crews. Imperial has a full crew of 36,000, but for the full functioning of the ship, 10,000 sailors and officers are enough. In reality, this number may be 10 times less. Yes, modern aircraft carriers have crews of several thousand people, and their sizes are tens of times smaller than the size of Star Destroyers. But automation and robotization will play an important role here. With developed artificial intelligence and the proper level of robotization, the full crew of the ship can be reduced to even several hundred people. For example, even in Star Wars, most of the ships of the fleet of the Confederacy of Independent System, the enemy of the Galactic Republic, have almost completely robotic crews. That is, there is not a single living creature on board. Among the advantages of this solution is the reduction of the ship's life support systems, which will save valuable internal space and reduce the cost of the ship. It also requires a significantly smaller number of qualified crew members. In general, even if there was everything necessary for the construction of a Star Destroyer, humanity would not have the main thing, the point in building such a ship. Real combat spaceships of similar sizes, if they will exist, will have a completely different design, appearance, and tactical and technical characteristics. By the way, the name Star Destroyer itself was not invented just to intimidate enemies. This class of ship includes ships of different classes, sizes, and purposes, which are united by the main similarity: very powerful weapons. Thanks to which, even one such ship is capable of causing an exterminatus on the planet in a few days, literally erasing all life from its surface. And a squadron of such ships could turn an entire star system into dust. Hence the name. By the way, let's imagine a theoretical situation in which our civilization would receive Imperial. Even then, the ship wouldn't make much sense. Firstly, there is simply no use for it. Secondly, maintaining such a ship will be catastrophically expensive from a financial point of view. And from a technological point of view, repairing the ship will simply be impossible due to the lack of necessary spare parts and equipment among Earthlings. Thus, to summarize, Star Destroyers from the Star Wars universe are in some aspects fundamentally impossible in our world. However, in simplified form, such ships can still exist in our universe. At best, humanity will be able to start building such a ship in a few decades, but the completed ship will make no sense, due to the extreme impracticality of its design, and the real ships that humanity will build will look completely different. One way or another, the iconic image of the Star Destroyer will remain only the preserve of science fiction.